Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. With the global economic system in place, it's no secret that the wealth concentration in a few hands is intensifying rapidly. As the rich are getting richer, according to Oxfam, between 2017 and 2018, a new billionaire was created every 2 days. Now, it is often perceived that billionaires are exemplifications of inequality. But what happens when billionaires turn to philanthropy and give away their fortunes to charity? It raises the question whether the concentration of wealth is always a bad thing. We try to make sense of these ideas on tonight's episode. Joining us for this discussion is Dr. Ian Cook, who's a political analyst. Also joining us, Benedicte Faivre, Tavignot, who's a professor of strategy and business policy. Thank you both for joining us. Dr. Ian, let me begin with you. So when we're talking about billionaires and their concentration of wealth, we've heard of how Warren Buffett and Bill Gates have signed a pledge to donate most of their wealth. How does this help towards the redistribution of wealth?
Well, I guess it provides some level of redistribution. It's not the sort of fundamental structural process of distributing rewards and benefits in a society. So it's, for the most part, it's a little bit cosmetic in terms of it not really addressing fundamental inequality, moving a little bit of money around, but not having any profound effect in terms of those sort of basic social
Dr.
structures.
Ian, you're saying just cosmetic, but Warren Buffett has stated that he wants to give 99% of his riches away. Is that still cosmetic?
Well, in terms, I know that's a lot of money that we're talking about, but in terms of the amount of money going through the world economy and the amount of money that's in, private hands, it still represents a relatively limited fraction of that. So I agree with you that it is a lot of money that we're talking about, but as I say, the world economy is just so much bigger than that it more or less dwarfs the sort of Warren Buffett type initiatives.
Yeah. So, Ms. Benedicte, do you agree with Dr. Ian here that the significance of this is very minimalist?
Well, I think it's better than nothing. And of course, it gives a good example to other very rich people and billionaires. But yes, the problem is deeper. And of course, it's the sharing of the value that it has at stake, and that we should maybe think today, and how do we share the value through the whole value chain of the company and among the different stakeholders.
Yeah.
So maximizing the profit on the one side, and then sometimes not taking into account the externalities, negative externalities of the business activity, and then giving money on the other side through philanthropy is not the solution to our problems. So it can maybe help some NGOs and foundations and some philanthropic actions, and have in a way big impact, for example, on health through the Gates Foundation, for example. But it does not solve the problem, and the problem is about sharing the value more equitably.
Yeah. So, Ms. Benedicte, you did say that here that it's better than nothing. And one thing I also want to touch upon is, while these are private individuals being involved in charities, we also hear a lot about how big corporations have social responsibility programs in which they donate. Can you tell us the benefit of this? And do you think in that it too is cosmetic?
Yeah. Well, again, it depends on the amount of money that maybe corporations will give through foundations, and you have small foundations from big corporations, and you can have bigger foundations having rather significant impact. But I think these foundations are in a way useful. They can help, for example, reduce extreme poverty, or help disabled people, or in case of extreme events, tsunamis, etc. I think philanthropy is important and necessary. And to tackle extreme poverty, I think these foundations are actually very useful. But then what is our point today is to rethink the way we do business in a more fundamental way, and the way that business is sharing the value among the different stakeholders that are shareholders, of course, but also employees, suppliers, clients, etc.
Yeah. Going back to something that Dr. Ian said earlier, and Dr. Ian, I want to ask you, you said that this is not the structural solution which is needed. So when we're talking about neoliberal economies, do you think proposing and expecting a structural solution for the redistribution of wealth is realistic?
I don't think it's very easy to achieve, and certainly in this environment where we're increasingly convinced by the capacity of markets and firms to achieve outcomes, and we're less convinced about the capacity of government. And as far as I'm concerned, and I guess I'm in politics, I see political solutions as quite important solutions, and part of what troubles me in this is this sense that governments are futile, useless. We can't help in these sorts of environments, and sometimes the philanthropic movements sort of tend to negate the capacity of governments or deny the capacity of governments, and that for me is, I think, part of what we need to look at.
Yeah. So when philanthropists make these efforts to go about, you are saying that it takes away from the responsibility governments have, and that's an important point there. But another thing I want to touch upon is that when we're talking about wealth gaps and income disparities between groups of people, is it even relevant to talk about, or is it even relevant to talk about relative incomes, or should we look at absolute standards? Because the World Bank states that poverty levels are decreasing. Brookings has stated that the middle income classes have increased significantly. So when we take that measure, aren't things getting better?
Oh, and I think there is some degree of some groups in some countries doing better, but in general, I think there's the inequality is growing. The extent to which money is increasingly in the hands of the pockets of 1%. And part of the problem is it's buying capacity. It's people being able to spend money that keeps economies functioning and going well. And if people get too poor, if they don't have enough money to buy, that's part of what creates some of the difficulties. And it's trying to make sure we've got people with enough money in their pockets to be able to keep the economy running. That's the sort of crucial problem. And there are times at which the inequality is starting to make that harder.
Yeah. And Ms. Benedicte, when we're talking about concentration of wealth being in a few hands, the Oxfam report also stated that 26 richest billionaires own as much as 3.8 billion of the poorest population. Now, I want to ask you here, what exactly happens when there's such a grave concentration of wealth?
Well, we have an example of this in France, with the Gilets Yellow Vest movement. There may be big social tensions. And I think the Yellow Vest movement is a good example of what these inequalities can lead to. And we are just at the start of this, And also, I would like to come back to this question of decrease in poverty. So globally, poverty is decreasing, but in some parts of the world, like South Africa, not South Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and even in countries like France, poverty is again increasing. So
So you're saying that making this global average is not realistic, is not a true picture of what's happening.
Yes, as was just said, in some countries, extreme poverty will decrease, but as I said, in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's not the case. And with the demography and the demographic growth, for example, in Africa, in the following years, where the population should double by 2050, and I think we should have by 2050 450 million more young people on the job market, with around only 200,000 people, 1,000 jobs, that new jobs proposed. So there will be lots of young people, again, without any future. And so this situation is obviously not sustainable. And, the migrations that we already see are just at the start.
Yeah. And that's an important point there. Dr. Ian, something that Ms. mentioned here was that average poverty levels might be decreasing across the world, but in some places such as South Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, it is not decreasing. In relation to that, I want to ask you, when we're talking about poverty not decreasing in some places, and with the advent of more aggressive technological progress, artificial intelligence coming about, how would that lead to greater disparities between incomes?
I think that's, you know, as you're saying, the problem is that increasing numbers of people are being replaced by technologies, and that means they're out of the job market, they're unable to, you know, generate income, and that's certainly, and I think the point we were making, you know, you were discussing before, it's young people that are very much suffering from these sorts of effects, and it's them who are, you know, having to be concerned about their future and their capacity to provide for themselves and the families perhaps that they're looking to have. And in an environment where it seems that technologies are increasingly replacing human workers, this is another factor behind the sort of growing poverty and the way in which it's falling on particular shoulders and not, you know, on everyone's.
And Dr. Ian, while we're talking about young people here, we are seeing a move, especially in the United States, of millennial socialists who are moving towards the idea of socialism while seeing what's happening. What could you tell us about that? Is this a global phenomenon, and can we expect it to increase in the future?
Well, I mean, I think the Occupy movement, which in some ways expresses some of these sentiments, has been something we're seeing worldwide. And you were discussing the Yellow Vests movement, and I think that's, you know, to some extent related to these. So I think there is a growing sense on the part of younger people in many countries around the world, at least, that, you know, they need to stand up for themselves and need to push to be able to create a future for themselves, because to an extent they're being left behind and forgotten by the generally older people who, for the most part, are dominating politics and getting their sort of, you know, interests represented.
Yeah, and I know this is going to be a loaded question here, but do you think young people are moving towards a utopian idea of society when they think that socialism can actually prevail?
They're certainly looking for answers, and they're looking for, you know, something different from what they've got, and you know, that means that sort of socialist type ideas, environmentalist ideas, you know, appeal to them, and certainly, yes, to an extent, you know, they are perhaps overly optimistic about what those systems can deliver, but on the other hand, they're, you know, feeling left out and excluded from the system that exists. So I guess they're sort of forced to look for something else.
Yeah. And Ms. Benedicte, can we see the same sentiments when we're talking about corporations and trade unions and workers? Can we see any of the same sentiments fostering a greater resentment towards these corporations?
Well, I think that, yeah, people are becoming more aware about this unfair distribution of wealth, and the trust that they have towards corporations is also negatively impacted. It was already impacted. It had been already impacted by different scandals.
Yeah.
But when we see, you know, studies on the gaps between the higher salaries and also average salary or a lower salary, this also impacts the trust that, for example, millennials have towards companies, and big companies are today, you know, quite afraid of attracting much less the millennials, for example. Not only for these reasons, but this is one of the reasons.
And Ms. Benedicte, when we're talking about these corporations and we move towards the owners of these corporations, is sustaining their own wealth becoming more difficult in these times?
Yeah, for big corporations, remaining competitive in this globalized world with, you know, so many disruptions becomes a challenge. So you have the digital disruption, you have demographic disruptions, you have environmental disruptions, and probably very wealthy people today will see some changes in their wealth in the coming years. But, you know, distribution is so, the you know, inequalities in this distribution is so high, and these people having so much money today, I'm not afraid for them. You know, I'm more fearing for again, these young people who do not have future. So we mentioned young people in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. In France, in the poor suburbs, you have unemployment rate of sometimes 45% among young people. So, and as I just has been said, the impact of technology will be also probably to increase this, again, these inequalities and the digital gap, and the fact that these people having little access to new technologies,
Ms. Benedicte, hold on to that thought. I want to come to that point later on, but I want to take the conversation in another direction and going back to what we were talking about, how billionaires accumulate their wealth. Dr. Ian, I want to ask you, when we're talking about intense wealth concentration here, is it mostly in the hands of those people who have had intergenerational transfers of wealth?
I think that a great deal of the wealth has come through inheritance and processes of familial transfer. So, a lot of the research seems to suggest that in terms of a significant proportion of, I'm not saying all of it, certainly there are exceptions, but quite a lot of the wealth is as a result of, as you say, intergenerational transfer.
And do you think an inheritance tax on this wealth could resolve the issue in any way, or move closer to a solution?
Well, I mean, certainly it's an answer that I've accepted for quite a long time, that in my view, that's at least one of the policy responses to be brought about. There's different places you can put an inheritance tax. It's not necessarily excessively onerous, but it's politically very difficult to introduce those sort of taxes. In many countries,
can you tell us why it exactly is politically difficult to introduce these sorts of taxes?
I think there's a variety of explanations. I mean, partly it's about individual incentive, and there's a perception that if you introduce inheritance taxes, you reduce incentive for parents to accumulate in order to pass on to their children. There's also a belief that the money that you generate is yours to do with as you will, and if you want to leave it to your forebears, your family, then that's fine too. So there's a sense of belief in private property, a sense of individual incentive. Then we've got the other aspects to it, that obviously the wealthy, have wealth and they can use it to exert political influence, and they can mobilise political campaigns against inheritance taxes. So I think there's a sort of general resistance, but there's also active political opposition.
Yeah, and Dr. Ian, you said that it's something you've accepted as being beneficial. Another counter that comes to inheritance tax, that it is unfair because you get taxation on your income as well. How would you respond to that, the unfair aspect of it?
Well, I accept the fact that is a consequence of inheritance taxes. But on the other hand, I mean, I think there are sort of positive social benefits to be derived from controlling the extent to which families can sort of accumulate massive, fortunes. And because those massive fortunes not only produce social inequality, they produce political inequality. They have capacity to influence political outcomes much greater than most other people. So in part, it's an economic thing, but it's also, for me, a political outcome, that we're looking to try to equalise people's capacity to influence politics. We know how powerful money is in politics, so it's obviously going to be effective in the hands of people who have it. And so it's a question of how we can, as it were, control them and reduce their capacity to influence political outcomes.
Okay, Dr. Ian, let's continue this. But before that, I just want to ask a last question to Ms. Benedicte. While we're talking about inheritance tax, I just want her opinion on this as well.
Well, I think we need public regulations on this question. But coming back to your first question, we also need probably private initiatives, as you mentioned at the start. Families, very wealthy families and business people deciding to allocate 99% of their wealth to a foundation is a good thing, I think. It does not solve the global problem, but is a good thing. And there is a for example, in France and in the US, yes, of course, probably more in the US. But, this movement of very wealthy people deciding to allocate a huge majority of their wealth to foundations, then it's the question of the use of the money of the foundation. Is it to influence, politics, or is it to really have a social impact and, for example, really support the underprivileged people and tackle problems on their roots, and not just, trying to do some marketing, in a way. So it's a question of the use of the money. But I think we need this movement of very wealthy people deciding not to give so much money to their own kids. And we know we have several examples of this, for example, in France.
Ms. Benedicte, you make a strong point there, and thank you so much for joining us and talking to Dr. Ian. While we're talking about this, I do want to ask your opinion on this. When we're talking about how people have accumulated so much wealth, and later on they say that this wealth is their personal use, do we not have to take into account that there were certain unfair practices in the past that allowed them to accumulate so much wealth, especially when we talk about race, gender, and several other factors?
I mean, certainly I think that we've got to look at the way in which that wealth was accumulated and just not sort of ignore the past, because, as you say, I mean, some of this was accumulated via slavery, in terms of opium trade. I mean, there's lots of, situations in which we might argue that wealth was perhaps not fully legitimately acquired. So, I mean, I think certainly that is an aspect of it. I mean, I think that on the other hand, we also have to recognise that it's society that creates conditions under which businesses can function. It's governments that create the situation, the circumstances where markets can function. That's part of the way in which people are able to accumulate wealth. So in some ways, it's social environments and social contexts that help people to become wealthy. And I think sometimes we forget that.
Yeah, and Dr. Ian, you mentioned that that our economies are created in such, and something that was also released in the Oxfam report was a statement made by the spokesperson that said the way our economies are organized, wealth is increasingly and unfairly concentrated amongst a privileged few. I just like you to take us through what is exactly the organizational structure of the modern economy that is leading to greater and greater intense concentration of wealth.
Well, I think very much it's a case of the way in which sort of networks are developing and sort of economic elite, which ends up being a group who educate their children together. They create a sort of a social environment where they're very sensitive to each other, but not necessarily to outsiders. And so we create an environment wherein the wealthy get somewhat insulated from the rest, and don't always sort of understand their role, their position, their status, and their responsibilities in the context of being wealthy in a society. And so for me, it's very much a case of the different sort of groups becoming isolated from each other, losing a sense of connection and therefore a sense of responsibility. And for me, that's what we're seeing increasingly, that the wealthy have sort of separated themselves out from the rest of society and created their networks that facilitate the growth of their wealth.
I take your point there, and thank you so much, Dr. Ian Cook, for joining us and talking to us. We're going to take a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. While we continue our discussion, now we're joined by Dr. Manindra Thakur, who is a social scientist. We're also joined by Dr. Taimur Rehman, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. Thank you both for joining us. Dr. Manindra, I'd like to begin with you. So when we're talking about billionaires and the intense concentration of wealth, what, in your opinion, does intergenerational transfer of wealth play here? What role does it play?
I think that plays a very important role because most of the countries have this rule that they transfer their wealth to the next generation without any major taxation. But also that due to the new kind of capitalism that is emerging, the new millionaires are growing, and there are a large number of people who are first-generation rich people. So I think part of that is intergenerational transfer. But a big part is also new accumulation.
Yeah. And Dr. Manindra, earlier we were talking about philanthropy in this case and charity, and we know that billionaires all across the world give away their charity, so much so that Warren Buffett has said that he wants to give away 99% of his income and wealth. What do you think is the social benefit of that?
I think charities generally are not really charities, because they are this other way of transferring the wealth. In the countries where the transfer of wealth is not allowed and there's high taxation, a lot of people transfer in order to manage the wealth for the next generation.
Yeah.
But in places where they do transfer, I think there is a major concern that the transfer is not for a real welfare, but for promotion of the business.
Yeah.
I don't think it plays a very big role, but yes, it does to some extent.
Yeah. Dr. Taimur Rehman, let me bring you into the conversation here. When we're talking about the narrative regarding those who have a lot of wealth and those who don't, it's often stated, especially in the capitalist system, that those who have so much wealth, they have deserved it, they are talented, they are intelligent, and therefore lies the disdain towards the poor because they do not have the talent and the intelligence to gain so much wealth. Do you think there needs to be a change in this narrative?
Most definitely, it's an untenable, even a ridiculous argument. It was, in fact, debunked even in the 18th century when the great economist Adam Smith wrote his book, The Wealth of Nations. And we all know that Smith is no communist or socialist or anti-capitalist. He's, in fact, very much, in favor of capitalism. And even there, Smith said, well, the profit of the capitalist is not equivalent to the labor of the capitalist because it is clearly correlated with the amount of capital invested and not with the amount of labor that's invested. Of course, he couldn't then further develop this idea to understand the theory of surplus value, which was left, well, first to Ricardo and later to Karl Marx. But the idea remains in popular culture despite having been debunked in economics time and time again. If I have a couple of crore rupees and you have 10,000 rupees and we both invest and we get the market rate of investment, rate of interest 10% or 12% or whatever it is, from my couple of crore, I'll make lakhs of profit. From your, a few lakh rupees, you'll make tens of thousands of rupees of profit, right? And therefore, I will be further ahead of you, even though we've invested in the same company. That's really how capital accumulation works. One last thing I'd say with respect to that is there's the great work by Thomas Piketty called Capital in the 21st Century, where he's proven that the growth in the wealth of the richest top 1% is faster than the rate of growth of the economy. And it's pretty much always been the case, except for a few short years in the post-war period, for a few countries. Globally, it's pretty much the case. So that's why today you have a state where 1% of the world's richest people control half the world's wealth. Yeah. And by the time our kids, that 1% is going to control maybe 75% of the world's wealth. Yeah.
And something that argument by Piketty that you mentioned here, I want to ask Dr. Manindra, we're seeing that, of course, there is a greater concentration of wealth, but Brookings has also reported that half of the world is now middle class or wealthier. So we're seeing an expansion of the middle class globally. Do you think that economic growth in any way, even though it's leading to the concentration of wealth in a few hands, is also helping some groups?
To some extent, yes. But I think what Piketty is arguing is just tip of the iceberg. A lot of people are arguing that capitalism is now reaching to a stage where it is difficult to call it capitalism. Capitalism, the founding fathers, Adam Smith and others, they all thought that probably capitalism would provide a lot of wealth to everybody. That's not going to happen anymore. The new idea is that capitalism has lost its legitimizing ideology. As earlier it was thought that capitalism would bring wealth. Second time, there was some reform, welfarism came. The third crisis of capitalism initiated a new kind of policy where the justice and liberty, other things were invoked. Now with the technology revolution and with the AI and all, probably the wealth will not be circulated at all. The circulation is in a big crisis. In that case, a new society might emerge.
Yeah. While we're talking about all of this, Dr. Taimur Rehman, something I want to touch upon is the privileges that are attached, which then lead to investment in many other things, not just wealth for the elite class. We're hearing about the college scandal that is taking over the US. And in relation to that, I just want to ask you, what happens when, for generations upon generations, there is intense accumulation of wealth and intense concentration of wealth? How does that benefit certain groups through generations?
Right. So let me begin by answering the question you asked previously about the supposed growing middle class. You see, there is a group of people that has more income than it did before.
Yeah.
So their absolute economic position has improved. But in capitalism, your absolute economic condition only improves as your social position declines. So while there are a larger number of people with a slightly greater number of income, most of whom are in fact in China, the number of people who are at the very top are so much more powerful and have grown so much more richer than the few people that have grown slightly richer, that their social power over the supposed middle class has grown. It's not really a middle class, actually, because you can't define class in terms of income anyway. You ought to define it in terms of relationship to each other. So it's not really a middle class at all. Now, on the second question of concentration, of course, this leads to parasiticism. It leads to decay. It leads to a kind of capitalism where you're able to use wealth to make wealth. You don't have to be productive. You can put money into the derivative market. You can do what George Soros does. You can play with entire economies. You can destroy the UK pound and make billions of pounds from it. You can destroy the South Korean economy, the Russian economy. You can bet against the currency of countries and offload currencies in such a manner that you make their currencies, you destroy their currencies, and then you buy that up. I mean, that calculative capitalism destroys all the efforts that millions of workers and people make to develop industry, to develop shipping, all of these various things.
Yeah.
So it's
Dr. Taimur Rehman,
an untenable situation.
Please hold on to that thought. I also want to introduce another guest who has joined us, Professor Arun Kumar, who's an economist, and he is India's leading authority on black economy and has written extensively regarding it and on the economy. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us. Professor, before we get into this topic even deeper, I want to ask you, what is the relation between intense wealth accumulation, which hinders economic growth? The IMF has stated this, that when the top 20% becomes, it has a greater accumulation of wealth, that affects the GDP growth. Can you take us through this?
Yeah, what happens is that first you earn an income, then you consume out of it, the balance is saved, and that is invested, and that investment accumulates into your wealth. So there is this process of income generation and wealth creation that takes place in the economy. Now, when you have higher disparities, what it implies is that the purchasing power at the top is not going to be spent so much on consumption as on savings. And unless that saving is invested, the demand in the economy would be short. And when demand is short, then capacity utilization goes down. And when capacity utilization goes down, then investment goes down.
Yeah.
And when investment goes down, demand again goes down. So this process where you have accumulation of wealth leading to more concentration of wealth and concentration of income tends to result in a decline in overall demand in the economy, which is why the growth rate tends to slow down.
Okay.
So this is probably what they have in mind. And if you look at India alone, the recent report suggested that 9 people hold as much wealth as 55% of the population does. So 9 people hold as much wealth as roughly about 600 million Indians hold.
Yeah.
And in income terms, 1% Indians earn as much as 22% Indians at the bottom earn. So the disparity in income and disparity in wealth is very large in India and a lot of the developing world. It's also very high in USA, but perhaps less than what it is in Europe. So these disparities are what result in this. And I'd like to quote what Henry Ford said when he built the T model. In 1912, he said that I want my workers to be able to buy my car. That means I have to pay them more,
Yeah.
And unless they can buy my car, mass production would not be successful,
Yeah.
So in other words, if you give more income at the bottom, then they spend more, and that leads to greater demand and to greater growth.
And Professor, when we're talking about policy measures, something that I want to ask you is a lot of literature is coming around it, a lot of conversation has been going around it, is universal basic income. I want to understand your thoughts upon it, and what do you think its value is to society?
Okay, so I think you're asking about universal basic income that people are talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, what has happened is because at the lower levels, people are having inadequate employment. When demand is down and production doesn't rise as much and productivity is rising, technology is displacing labor, then you have lack of employment and therefore lack of income generation. And therefore, these people don't have the purchasing power. And that is what is resulting in a disturbance all across the globe, where you see anti-establishment moves. So, the election of Trump was seen as an anti-establishment move. Hillary Clinton was seen to be part of establishment, And establishment is supposed to be resulting in greater unemployment and crisis at the lower levels. The same is true of Brexit, and the same is true of Ms. Merkel facing problems in Germany, Mr. Macron coming in France, and the traditional parties going out. So in a sense, globally, this is true, that there is a crisis of employment and therefore crisis of incomes at lower level, and that is resulting in a crisis of capitalism because of inadequate demand. So universal basic income is being suggested as a means of giving at least some basic amount of money to everybody so that demand can be buoyed up. But this is actually really a palliative. It's not really a solution, because as long as the tendency for displacement of labor continues and as long as the income disparities rise, then what will happen is that you'll have to keep on increasing this universal basic income for everybody, because people will keep falling off from the employment net.
Yeah.
So in other words,
Professor Arun, hold on to that thought. I also want to ask Dr. Manindra same point here, but in relation to how it affects society. A lot of people say giving the universal basic income, creating that safety net, would make workers complacent. Is that an idea you also share?
I don't think. I think basic income, universal basic income, is basically to hold the possibility of any unrest. Since there is a disparity and finally some form of democracy would exist. So there's a fear also that the huge inequality might create so massive unrest that it would be difficult to manage society. So it seems that the idea of the basic income is just to kind of doling out something so that you don't need really to organize any political move to throw the regime. So this is the new move of capitalism to defend itself. Nothing beyond that. I think the amount that will be given to them may not be sufficient for running the market also. I think in this, what is happening is that the first world will do it in order to be able to invest more on the armament industries, military industries, and the third world will have to squeeze its welfare economy to purchase this thing. So first world probably will be able to give a little more money. But what will happen to the rest of the world? What will happen to the third world? We can't even think about giving basic minimum income to everybody. It will be just kind of second thing so that the resentment can be contained.
And that's a strong point you make there. Dr. Taimur Rehman, I want to take this discussion towards the values that have supported the current system, which has caused for such a great concentration of wealth. How do you believe values have evolved, let's say, in the past decade, which has caused for 26 people in the world to hold the amount of wealth that the poorest 3.8 billion people have?
Well, clearly the values of popular culture, popular culture now tends to be dominated by a few major corporations that belong to the super rich. Films are produced there, newspapers are produced, television networks, the works basically. Globally speaking, I mean, there may be local media houses that are different from it, but globally they set the agenda, they set the they set the standard for art and progress. And you can see that there's a massive culture of we can talk about any issue, we can talk about anything, we can men can become women, women can become men, you can change your identity, there's no problem about any other issue, but if you talk about changing the way in which wealth and income are distributed, that's a no-go area, right?
Yeah.
So most of culture, sadly has become very escapist and,
Dr. Taimur Rehman, do you think that's another issue with the coming generation? Because we're seeing that there seems to be a greater fascination with socialism growing amongst the newer generation.
Yes, absolutely right. I think young people are seeing through this nonsense every single day and becoming more and more aware of it and becoming more and more politicized. I think the time where, Abraham Lincoln had a beautiful saying, you can fool some people all the time. You can fool all the people sometime, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And that's really what's going on now with what you're seeing across the world, which is that from the 1990s till about recently, you pretty much fooled most of the people for this entire period into thinking that capitalism represented the end of history. But I think people have woken up to the reality of what capitalism really is.
Yeah. Professor Arun, do you also believe that people have woken up to the reality of what capitalism is?
People realize that there's a problem, and that's why there's an anti-establishment move. But let me also add that today, the globalization that we see is actually a process of marketization, where market principles have penetrated all, institutions of society and into our thinking. So basic thinking has changed. So marketization process depends on first, as Samuelson said, the dollar vote. So what the dollar vote means is one person who has $1 has one vote, another who has $1 million has 1 million votes. So it undermines democracy. And that's why you find that globally it's the big institutions and the big countries that dominate policy making. And that's why international finance capital is able to dominate policy making. Second principle that comes into play is that more is better. If more is better, then I should consume more, rather than sacrifice. And if I consume more, that's the underlying basis of consumerism. So
Yeah.
I see consumerism as the new opium of the masses. People have been involved in increasing consumption, and therefore the real issues recede to the background. And that's how people's attention is diverted, whether it be through advertising, it be through creating needs, desires where the need doesn't exist, So you have, for instance, Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola, which is 99% water, as a desirable thing rather than having plain water, So things like that have happened.
Yeah.
And what it has done is it has turned human beings into homo economicus, that only economics matters. Society doesn't matter.
So,
History
Professor
doesn't
Arun,
matter.
let me ask you this. When we're talking about policies to be implemented in order to close in the wealth gap, what can we talk about which is not too idealistic and which can actually be implemented given the global economic system?
Yeah, so, the point I was making is that people's consciousness has changed. And how would that consciousness change? That would change through movements. And that's where we had the 1% against 99%. We had the Arab Spring, etc. They were temporary. But these movements can once again rise as the crisis increases. Now, in terms of policy, as long as policy is in the control of international finance capital, you don't see much chance of policy changing. For instance, in India, we have the revolving door policy. Same people in policy making are there in the Indian government as in the IMF, World Bank, ADB, etc. So they bring the same kind of analysis into policy making. So any alternate policy making has no space. And that is where, unless this grip of the international finance capital is loosened, you cannot have alternate policies. Otherwise, if you had more equitable policies in the country, that would lead to some better results. Like, for instance, you had the welfare policies earlier, which have now receded. So problems in health, in education, etc. are rising. And people's education, especially in India, we have the ACER annual survey of education reports, which show that 50% children in the 5th class cannot read second-class textbook, cannot do second-class maths, cannot do second-class writing. That means these children will never be able to do a modern job, get a good income. So we are assured of 50% poverty for the next 50 years. Now, unless we begin to spend more on public education, more on public health, etc., and for that we need the resources.
Yeah.
And that international finance capital prevents the government from generating those resources because it says...
Professor Arun, we're running on time. I've registered your point there, and it's very an important point you've made there. I want to put my last question to Dr. Taimur Rehman and Dr. Manindra. Dr. Taimur Rehman, I'll ask you first, how important is it to remember the concept of equity when we discuss those who have a greater concentration of wealth and those who are trying to get there?
I think it's very vital. I think, for society to move forward, by equity, you mean equality, egalitarianism, not capital equity, right?
Yeah.
I assume that's what you mean. Yes. Well, I think it's fundamental. I think, moving to the next stage of human civilization requires that we rebuild a system, recreate a system which is based on some fundamental idea of equality, socialism, egalitarianism, and equity. If we don't do that, we run the risk of creating a world which is unsustainable.
Yeah.
It's unsustainable not only because it's causing incredible climate change and causing a crisis. It's unsustainable because there's, on the one hand, runaway consumerism, and on the other hand, glaring poverty.
Yeah.
It's unsustainable because it gives rise to militarism and destruction, and the chasing, sort of monopolizing markets and resources, and it's given rise to to world wars that are absolutely terrible. It's given rise to nuclear weapons that can destroy the world 40 times over. What are we doing with the world? We're not.
And Dr. Taimur Rehman, I'm going to take the same point that you've made here to Dr. Manindra. Do you think that we are moving towards a more unsustainable world, and if we don't take a hold on to the system that's in place, things are just going to go downhill from there?
Absolutely. I think I'll just add on something what Professor Arun Kumar said. There is something happening called politics of imagination.
Yeah.
See, our imagination is being captured. There is a kind of investment on the imagination. And that's why it is very difficult to raise a consciousness against the system. But the fact is that if it is not being done, if equitable distribution is not implemented, the kind of instrument of mass killing that we have developed, and the kind of cheapness of instrument, the availability of the mass killing, there will be disastrous consequences.
Yeah.
So therefore, we have to work towards equitable distribution. There's no way out in the world.
Thank you so much, Dr. Manindra Thakur, for joining us, Dr. Taimur Rehman for joining us, Professor Arun Kumar for joining us. It was great talking to you all. Thanks for watching Indus Special. We'll see you again next week with more stories. Take care and goodbye.